In the frozen forests of northwestern Russia, just 5,000 German troops were cut off and surrounded by more than 30,000 Soviet soldiers for 110 days. But they did not fall. Supplied only from the air, starving, freezing, and under constant assault, their survival reshaped German operational thinking for the rest of the war. The question is not how they fought, but why their survival would later help doom an entire army at Stalingrad. By the winter of 1941-1942, the Eastern Front of the Second World War had entered a new phase. The German advance of Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June 1941 with approximately 3.3 million Axis troops, had failed to deliver a decisive defeat of the Soviet Union before the onset of winter. By December 1941, German Army Group Center had been halted outside Moscow, and on 5 December, the Red Army initiated a large-scale counteroffensive. Across the entire front, from Leningrad to the Black Sea, German forces were forced into defensive positions under conditions for which they were structurally unprepared: sub-zero temperatures, overstretched supply lines, and critical shortages of winter equipment. In the northwestern sector, the strategic situation was shaped by the struggle for control of the Baltic approaches and the land corridors between Army Group North and Army Group Center. The Soviet Northwestern Front, reorganized after heavy losses in 1941, was tasked with disrupting the German defensive line and restoring Soviet control over key transportation nodes. The town of Kolm, located approximately 75 kilometers south of Lake Ilmen and roughly 100 kilometers west of Toropets, lay directly on the intersection of several secondary road networks linking rear area supply routes. Although Kolm itself had no heavy industry and a civilian population of about 6,000 before the war, its geographic position made it a junction point for German communications supporting operations between Staraya Russa and Velikiye Luki. By January 1942, Soviet command aimed to exploit German weaknesses through a series of regional offensives rather than a single concentrated strike. One of these efforts was part of the broader Toropets-Kolm offensive operation, launched on 9 January 1942. The operation involved elements of the 3rd and 4th Shock armies and supporting rifle and cavalry units. Their goal was to break through thin German defensive lines, cut rear area communications, and encircle forward German formations operating in the Demyansk-Staraya Russa sector. The Soviet forces allocated to this area numbered approximately 80,000 to 90,000 men in total, equipped with several hundred artillery pieces and limited armored support adapted to winter conditions. Opposing them in the Kolm region was a fragmented German rear area garrison composed of elements drawn from different formations. These included parts of the 123rd Infantry Division, security battalions, police units, engineer detachments, and administrative personnel. The total strength of the German force in and around Kolm at the beginning of January 1942 is generally estimated at roughly 5,000 to 5,500 men. Heavy equipment was minimal. The garrison possessed limited artillery, mainly light field guns and mortars, and no operational armored vehicles at the time Soviet forces advanced. Ammunition stocks were calculated for routine security duties rather than for prolonged siege warfare. German strategic priorities in this sector were defensive by necessity. High Command aimed to stabilize the front after the setbacks of December 1941 and to prevent Soviet forces from cutting off large German formations operating forward of the main defensive lines. Kolm fell within the responsibility zone of the German 16th Army under Army Group North. Intelligence reports during late December 1941 indicated increased Soviet troop movements in the Toropets region, but German estimates underestimated both the scale and the operational intent of the Soviet buildup. The assumption within several German headquarters was that Soviet winter operations would remain localized and limited by logistical constraints. On the Soviet side, strategic motivations were shaped by both military necessity and political pressure. Following the defense of Moscow, Soviet leadership sought offensive successes that could demonstrate the Red Army's recovery and help relieve pressure on Leningrad, which remained under siege since September 1941. The Northwestern Front was ordered to disrupt German supply flows and force the enemy into isolated defensive pockets that could be reduced individually. Kolm was identified as a suitable target due to its thinly defended garrison and the possibility of rapid encirclement using mobile ski troops and cavalry formations. Logistical preparations on both sides reflected asymmetrical conditions. Soviet formations were supplied through a combination of rail transport from Valdai and overland sled columns across forested terrain. German supply routes relied primarily on overstretched road networks, vulnerable to snow accumulation and partisan activity. Public sentiment within the Soviet Union following the defense of Moscow was one of cautious optimism, while morale among German rear area troops was strained by constant cold exposure and the knowledge that major frontline formations had already lost the initiative. By the first week of January 1942, the operational conditions around Kolm were defined by frozen rivers, heavy snow cover averaging 30 to 50 centimeters, and daily temperatures frequently falling below 20 degrees 6. Both sides were preparing for an engagement that neither initially expected to evolve into a prolonged siege lasting several months. On 9 January 1942, the Soviet Toropets Kolm offensive began with coordinated attacks across a broad sector of the Northwestern Front. The main striking force assigned to the Kolm direction consisted of formations from the 3rd Shock Army, supported by rifle divisions, ski battalions, and cavalry units trained for deep winter maneuver. Soviet commanders sought rapid penetration rather than a methodical breakthrough. Their intention was to bypass strongpoints, advance through forest corridors, and sever German rear communications before the enemy could conduct an organized withdrawal. Within the first 48 hours, Soviet forward detachments achieved penetrations of 15 to 25 kilometers through thin German screening lines. German security battalions and rear area units, normally tasked with guarding roads and depots, were quickly overwhelmed or forced to retreat without sustained resistance. By 12th of January, Soviet ski units had crossed several frozen river lines south of Lake Ilmen and cut minor road links feeding German positions in the Staraya Russa sector. This disruption coincided with heavy pressure against German field divisions along the broader front, limiting the capacity for rapid redeployment. The town of Kolm was approached from multiple directions between 13 and 15 January. Soviet cavalry detachments advancing from the south and southwest intercepted traffic on the Kolm-Toropets road, while rifle units closed in from the east. German field communications reported the loss of several outlying villages and the destruction of isolated transport columns carrying rations and ammunition. These early losses further reduced the already limited stockpiles inside Kolm. German command in the sector initially interpreted the Soviet penetration as a raid, rather than the opening of a sustained offensive. Orders issued on 14th of January directed rear area units to delay the enemy and maintain control of Kolm as a communications node for as long as possible. Responsibility for coordinating the defense fell to General Theodor Scherer, commander of the 281st Security Division, who was present in the area and assumed operational control of the mixed garrison. At that moment, the total German force within Kolm consisted of approximately 5,000 men, including infantry, engineers, police companies, medical staff, and administrative personnel. Between 15 and 17 January, Soviet forces established a tightening arc around the town. German attempts to reopen the roads using small motorized columns failed due to blocked routes, destroyed bridges, and Soviet ambushes along forest sections. On 17 January, the last recognized ground connection between Kolm and German-held territory to the west was severed near the village of Sushino. This action marked the effective encirclement of the town. The first direct assault on Kolm occurred on 18th January 1942. Soviet rifle units advanced from the northeastern edge of the town, supported by light artillery, positioned on frozen ground beyond effective German counter-battery range. The German defenders relied primarily on infantry weapons, including MG-34 machine guns, mortars of 50 and 81 mm caliber, and a very limited number of field guns. The initial Soviet assault was repelled after several hours of fighting, during which both sides sustained casualties. German reports for that day list approximately 90 killed and wounded, while Soviet losses are estimated at 150 to 200 men for the aborted breakthrough attempt. Following the failed assault, Soviet command shifted to systematic encirclement rather than immediate reduction. By 20th of January, Soviet units had completed the isolation of Kolm on all sides at a distance ranging from 2 to 5 kilometers from the town perimeter. Artillery fire was increased against known German strongpoints, supply depots, and communication centers. Civilian housing within Kolm suffered extensive damage as bombardments intensified. A large proportion of the remaining civilian population, estimated at 2,500 to 3,000 persons by that time, sought shelter in cellars and improvised underground dugouts. German radio traffic on 21st January confirmed to higher headquarters that Kolm was fully surrounded. Requests for immediate relief by ground forces were denied due to the ongoing crisis at Demyansk and the heavy pressure across a broader front. As an interim measure, the German Air Force initiated emergency air supply operations using Ju-52 transport aircraft. These flights, operating from forward airfields under winter conditions, could deliver only a fraction of daily requirements. On average, between late January and early February, airlift capacity fluctuated between 15 and 30 tons per day, while minimum daily demand inside the pocket ranged from 60 to 80 tons, primarily for food, medical supplies, and ammunition. By the end of January 1942, the siege conditions had fully taken shape. The German garrison was isolated, undersupplied, and facing repeated probing attacks. Soviet forces, despite numerical superiority estimated at between 25,000 and 30,000 troops committed to the Kolm sector alone, encountered difficulties in concentrating heavy artillery and armored units through forest terrain and deep snow. What had begun as a rapid breakthrough phase was now evolving into a sustained siege operation shaped by logistics, weather, and the physical exhaustion of both sides. With the encirclement of Kolm completed by 20th of January 1942, both sides entered a phase defined by strategic calculation under severe logistical constraints. For the Soviet command of the Northwestern Front, the objective was no longer limited to disruption of communications. The destruction of the Kolm garrison became a formal operational goal. Its elimination would further destabilize the junction between German Army Group North and Army Group Center and deepen the widening gap created by the offensives near Toropets and Demyansk. The success of such encirclements was also viewed as a practical test of Soviet winter warfare doctrine, which emphasized isolation, attrition, and reduction of enemy pockets without direct large-scale armor engagement. Soviet operational planning assigned the main burden of siege operations to rifle divisions reinforced with ski battalions and artillery groups pulled forward over frozen forest tracks. Heavy artillery remained limited due to transport difficulties. Most batteries available to the Soviet units around Kolm consisted of 76 mm divisional guns and 122 mm howitzers. Ammunition stocks were sufficient for periodic bombardments, but not for continuous fire. The absence of medium and heavy tanks forced Soviet commanders to rely on infantry assaults supported by direct-fire artillery and mortars. Supply columns used sleds and horse transport to maintain flow from rear depots, with average daily resupply estimated at 200 to 250 tons for the sector around Kolm, covering food, ammunition, fuel, and winter equipment. German strategic objectives were defensive and time-oriented. The High Command of Army Group North did not assign immediate priority to ground relief of Kolm in late January. Instead, the garrison was expected to hold long enough for the stabilization of the broader front and for local counteroffensive capability to be restored. The German 16th Army calculated that a relief attempt would require the concentration of at least 2 infantry divisions and supporting artillery, a force unavailable during the simultaneous crisis in the Demyansk pocket, where approximately 100,000 German troops were already encircled. As a result, Kolm was designated an air-supplied strongpoint. Its continued resistance was intended to fix Soviet forces in place and prevent their redeployment to more operationally decisive sectors. The planning of the German air supply operation followed principles similar to those later applied at Demyansk. Daily minimum requirements were calculated as approximately 75 to 80 tons, including 32 tons of food, 18 tons of ammunition, 10 tons of medical supplies, winter clothing, radio batteries, and fuel for limited generator use. The Luftwaffe initially allocated between 12 and 18 Ju-52 transport aircraft to the Kolm airlift. Under winter conditions and Soviet fighter activity, average sortie completion rates ranged between 40 and 60%. During the last 10 days of January, actual average deliveries remained between 18 and 25 tons per day, well below survival-level planning figures. Inside the pocket, General Scherer reorganized the defense according to a layered system. The perimeter was divided into sectors, each assigned to improvised battle groups drawn from infantry, engineers, police detachments, and signal personnel. Buildings of stone construction were converted into strongpoints. Wooden structures were largely abandoned or dismantled for firewood. Streets were obstructed with felled timber, sandbags, and overturned vehicles to limit the penetration of infantry assault groups. Ammunition rationing was immediately enforced. Machine gun belts were allotted per hour of combat, and mortar fire was restricted to pre-registered Soviet assembly areas. Soviet planning for the reduction of the pocket relied on sequential pressure. Rather than a single-massed assault, the command intended to shrink the pocket through repeated localized attacks targeting specific sectors of the German perimeter. Artillery strikes were scheduled at irregular intervals to disrupt German defensive routines and prevent the establishment of fixed rest periods. At the same time, reconnaissance units were tasked with locating the frozen airstrip zones used by German transport aircraft. Several temporary landing grounds on the outskirts of Kholm were identified based on observed landing activity between 22 and 26 January. These areas were incorporated into Soviet fire plans to challenge German aerial logistics. Propaganda considerations also shaped planning on both sides. Soviet political officers were instructed to emphasize the symbolic importance of destroying the surrounded enemy garrison as evidence of the Red Army's ability to annihilate encircled formations. German command, in contrast, framed the air-supplied resistance of Kolm as a demonstration of defensive endurance under isolation. Radio communiques transmitted from the pocket were selectively released to illustrate operational control despite encirclement. By the final days of January 1942, both sides had completed their basic operational preparations. The Soviets had assembled approximately 25,000 to 30,000 troops with artillery support around the perimeter. The German garrison remained fixed at roughly 5,000 defenders, with daily combat-ready strength fluctuating due to frostbite, illness, and casualties. Strategic goals were now firmly defined, one side aimed at reduction through sustained pressure, the other at survival through delay and limited aerial resupply. The first systematic engagements along the Kolm perimeter began in the final days of January 1942. Soviet rifle battalions initiated coordinated attacks against the northeastern and eastern sectors of the German defensive ring on 28 and 29 January. These actions were preceded by short artillery preparations lasting 20 to 30 minutes, primarily involving 76 mm divisional guns and 82 mm mortars. Fire density remained limited due to ammunition conservation. The German defenders responded with pre-registered machine gun and mortar fire from fortified buildings and trench networks dug into the frozen ground. On 30th January, Soviet units attempted to penetrate the eastern sector near the Kolm brickworks area, where the German perimeter narrowed to approximately 800 meters. 3 rifle companies advanced in successive waves, supported by direct fire artillery, positioned on frozen open ground 1.5 kilometers from the German line. The assault reached the outer trench line in several locations, but failed to achieve a permanent breach. German after-action reports list 34 killed and 71 wounded for that day. Soviet operational journals record 210 casualties in the attacking units, including 58 killed. The outcome established a pattern that would repeat over the following weeks. Localized Soviet penetrations, followed by German counterfire and restoration of the defensive line. Simultaneously, Soviet forces increased pressure on German aerial resupply operations. On 2 February 1942, Soviet anti-aircraft units deployed 4 37mm guns and several heavy machine gun sections along the southwestern approach corridors used by Ju-52 transports. That day, 2 German aircraft were damaged during landing attempts on a frozen strip near the central square of Kolm. One transport crashed during rollout due to a combination of engine failure and small arms damage. The loss reduced the operational airlift capacity by approximately 8% for the following week. Between 3 and 7 of February, Soviet command launched a series of night assaults using ski battalions to infiltrate wooded sections of the perimeter. These operations aimed to disrupt German rest cycles and force continuous alert status. On the night of 4 February, Soviet detachments temporarily seized a forward German observation post overlooking the Lavat River bend. The position was recaptured by a German engineer platoon after 6 hours of close-quarters engagement. Casualty reports indicate 19 German casualties and an estimated 45 Soviet losses in that encounter alone. Civilian conditions deteriorated rapidly as engagements intensified. By early February, approximately 70% of permanent housing within Kholm had sustained structural damage from artillery or aerial bombardment. Food reserves inside the pocket fell to an estimated 350 grams of bread per soldier per day, supplemented by limited horse meat recovered from transport animals killed during earlier attacks. Medical facilities operated in cellars with minimal heating. Frostbite accounted for an increasing proportion of non-combat casualties. Between 1 and 10 of February, German medical records indicate over 240 cases of moderate to severe cold injury. Soviet efforts to breach the northern sector intensified on 8 February with an assault involving 2 rifle battalions supported by 122mm howitzer fire from concealed forest positions. The bombardment destroyed several German strongpoints constructed in wooden housing blocks, but the attackers encountered intact stone structures behind the initial defensive layer. German machine gun fire from upper floors forced the Soviet units to withdraw after 5 hours of engagement. That day's combat resulted in approximately 63 German casualties and an estimated 270 Soviet casualties. Morale on both sides fluctuated with operational outcomes. Soviet political officers reported declining assault cohesion after repeated failures to achieve decisive penetration, but reinforcement drafts continued to arrive, sustaining numerical superiority. German morale was increasingly tied to the regular arrival of air supply sorties. Each successful landing preserved a baseline of operational capability. Each failure translated immediately into food and ammunition shortages. Between 1 and 10 of February, the Luftwaffe delivered a cumulative total of approximately 190 tons of supplies to Kolm, against a calculated minimum requirement of 750 to 800 tons for that period. By mid-February 1942, the opening phase of the siege's direct combat engagements had established the framework of the struggle. Soviet forces retained full encirclement and local numerical dominance. German units maintained a continuous defensive perimeter, but with steadily diminishing material reserves. Territorial control remained largely unchanged, but both sides had now committed themselves to sustained attritional engagement rather than rapid resolution. By mid-February 1942, the siege of Kolm entered a phase of sustained escalation marked by rising casualties, deepening logistical failure, and expanding tactical pressure on both sides. Soviet command increased the density and frequency of attacks, no longer limiting operations to isolated probing actions. Between 12 and 18 February, daily assaults were conducted along at least 3 sectors of the German perimeter. These actions were coordinated with rolling artillery fire intended to deny the defenders predictable recovery intervals. On 13 February, Soviet artillery units concentrated 96 artillery pieces and heavy mortars for a focused barrage on the southeastern sector. The preparatory fire lasted for 70 minutes and expended approximately 4,200 rounds, including 122mm and 76mm shells. Several German forward positions collapsed under structural damage rather than infantry assault. A Soviet rifle regiment advanced into a breach measuring approximately 400 meters wide and temporarily secured 3 street blocks before German engineers counterattacked using demolition charges and close-range machine gun fire. By nightfall, the breach was sealed. German losses for the day reached 81 killed and wounded, while Soviet losses exceeded 300 men according to regimental medical logs. The cumulative effect of this escalation placed decisive strain on German medical capacity. The Central Field Hospital, originally designed for 60 patients, was forced to accommodate over 280 wounded and frostbite cases by 15 February. Surgical operations were conducted without electrical lighting, except when small generators could be briefly activated. Morphine stocks were critically reduced. Amputation cases increased as a result of gangrene caused by untreated cold injuries. The airlift delivered limited medical equipment, but competing priorities such as food and ammunition severely restricted medical resupply. On the Soviet side, escalation produced its own crisis effects. Infantry replacements arrived at a higher tempo, but transport bottlenecks through forest corridors limited the timely delivery of heavy weapons. Fuel shortages reduced artillery towing capacity, forcing some batteries to remain fixed in static positions for extended periods. Reports from the 3rd Shock Army Medical Service indicate that between 10 and 20 February, non-combat casualties from exhaustion, frostbite, and illness exceeded 1,900 cases across assault formations operating around Kolm. German defensive effectiveness became increasingly dependent on air resupply under deteriorating weather conditions. Between 15 and 25 February, snowfall frequently reduced visibility below 900 meters, halving the successful sortie completion rate. During this 10-day period, only 112 tons of supplies reached the pocket against a calculated minimum need of 720 tons. Ammunition rationing became extreme. Machine gun positions were authorized to fire only during confirmed assault waves. Mortar stocks fell below 25% of authorized basic load. Soviet command intensified efforts to interdict the air supply corridor. On 17th of February, a concentrated anti-aircraft ambush was executed along the western approach route. 3 Ju-52 transport aircraft were hit during descent. 2 crash-landed outside the perimeter and were destroyed by Soviet infantry within hours. 1 managed an emergency landing inside the pocket but was rendered inoperable. These losses reduced the transport group assigned to Kolm to fewer than 10 serviceable aircraft. Civilian conditions reached a critical threshold during this period. Food distribution for civilians fell below 150 grams per day of mixed flour and frozen vegetables. Water was obtained by melting contaminated snow. By 20th of February, civilian mortality inside the town, primarily caused by hypothermia, hunger, and untreated illness, exceeded 400 recorded deaths since the start of the siege. Burials were conducted in mass graves excavated using explosives due to frozen ground conditions. The operational situation reached formal crisis stage on 22 February. German field communications reported that ammunition stocks for several perimeter sectors would be exhausted within 72 hours at current rates of fire. Soviet forces at the same time reported rising fatigue and declining assault tempo, but sustained full control of surrounding road networks. With no ground relief force yet assembled and the Demyansk crisis unresolved, the German garrison at Kholm entered the most critical phase of its isolation, defined by material depletion rather than immediate tactical defeat. The final days of February and the first week of March 1942 marked the peak intensity of the fighting around Kolm. Soviet command initiated its most concentrated effort to eliminate the pocket, redeploying additional artillery assets and reinforcing assault groups drawn from neighboring sectors of the 3rd Shock Army. By 25th of February, the Soviet force directly engaged in the reduction of the pocket reached approximately 32,000 troops, with over 140 artillery pieces and heavy mortars available for short, concentrated bombardments. On 26th of February, a coordinated attack was launched against the western and southwestern sectors of the perimeter. The preparatory bombardment lasted 90 minutes and involved an estimated 6,000 artillery and mortar rounds. Several German defensive positions constructed in former administrative buildings were destroyed by direct hits. Soviet infantry entered two penetration corridors, one 300 meters wide and the other approximately 500 meters wide. For the first time since the beginning of the siege, Soviet units reached the central residential district of Kolm in scattered groups. German counteraction relied on reserve platoons drawn from previously quiet sectors and from staff personnel reorganized into emergency infantry detachments. By the end of the day, the Soviet advance had been contained at distances ranging from 400 to 700 meters from the town center. German losses on 26 February were recorded at 94 killed and wounded. Soviet medical evacuation lists indicate 370 casualties for the same engagement. The following 2 days saw uninterrupted fighting. On 27 and 28 February, Soviet assault groups conducted continuous attacks using small unit tactics supported by close-range artillery fire. German defenders increasingly relied on hand grenades, MP-40 submachine guns, and short-range machine gun fire from cellar and window positions. Ammunition consumption reached critical levels. Several perimeter sectors reported less than 200 small arms rounds per defended strongpoint by the end of 28 February. Mortar stocks in the pocket fell below 15% of original inventory. At the same time, Luftwaffe airlift capacity reached its lowest point since the beginning of the siege. On 1 March 1942, Soviet command conducted the largest single assault of the siege. 3 rifle regiments attacked simultaneously along the southern arc, supported by direct fire from 122 mm howitzers firing over open sights. The assault achieved temporary control over a section of the outer German trench system, extending over 1.2 kilometers of the perimeter. German defenders launched a counterattack after 14 hours, supported by their last available reserve, approximately 180 men drawn from communications, supply staff, and hospital orderlies. Fighting continued into the night. By 02 Zaixer on the 2nd March, the original line had been partially restored. The fighting of 1 to 2 March resulted in approximately 130 German casualties and an estimated 540 Soviet casualties across the attacking formations. This phase represented the maximum operational pressure applied at Kolm. Soviet forces had achieved their deepest temporary penetrations, but remained unable to deliver a decisive rupture of the perimeter. German resistance, while materially exhausted, had not collapsed structurally. By early March 1942, both sides had reached the practical limits of sustained assault and defense under winter siege conditions, setting the stage for a shift in operational momentum rather than further immediate escalation. By early March 1942, both forces around Kolm were forced into a phase defined less by raw assault power and more by adaptation under extreme constraint. For the German garrison, survival now depended on structural reorganization rather than firepower. With ammunition stocks critically low, defensive doctrine shifted from perimeter saturation to elastic defense. Forward strongpoints that could no longer be sustained were deliberately abandoned during the night, shortening the defensive ring by approximately 400 to 600 meters in several sectors. This controlled contraction reduced the length of the perimeter from roughly 9.5 kilometers in January to just under 7 kilometers by 5 March, allowing the remaining combat-capable units to increase troop density per defended sector by an estimated 18 to 22%. German engineers implemented a system of internal fallback lines built from the rubble of destroyed buildings. Stone debris was repurposed into knee-high breastworks inside courtyards and along street intersections. Sewer tunnels and basement passages were mapped and converted into protected movement routes, permitting limited troop redeployment without surface exposure to artillery and sniper fire. These adaptations allowed the garrison to preserve tactical flexibility despite the collapse of formal reserve units. Soviet forces simultaneously adjusted their operational approach. After repeated failed mass assaults, command shifted toward incremental erosion through infiltration, sniping, and precision artillery targeting. Between 4 and 12th of March, over 60% of Soviet artillery expenditure was redirected toward pre-registered German supply drop zones and known medical evacuation shelters rather than frontline trenches. Fire control data collected from forward observers embedded with assault battalions allowed several airdrop corridors to be temporarily suppressed for periods of 12 to 24 hours at a time. Psychological pressure increased markedly on both sides. Soviet sniper groups were deployed systematically along the northern and eastern sectors, targeting movement in windows, entrances, and cellar access points. German records indicate 73 confirmed sniper-related casualties between 6 and 18 March. In response, German defenders installed internal movement schedules that limited surface exposure to fixed 2-minute intervals per strongpoint, coordinated by whistle signals and short radio bursts. Improvisation became decisive in sustaining minimal combat effectiveness. German units dismantled unused radios to extract copper wiring for field repairs. Fuel from crashed aircraft engines was siphoned to power a single remaining generator assigned exclusively to the central communications bunker. Lubricants were produced by melting recovered animal fat. For the Soviet troops, sled transport routes were reinforced with plank systems built from dismantled rural structures to prevent collapse under repeated load cycles. Ammunition supply remained more stable on the Soviet side. Average daily delivery to artillery units remained near 120 tons despite partisan interference along feeder routes. Morale dynamics shifted unevenly. Soviet infantry units rotating through the Kolm ring exhibited declining assault motivation but maintained high compliance with containment missions. Political department reports from mid-March show that desertion rates in several rifle regiments increased from a January baseline of 0.3% to 1.1%. German morale was increasingly tied to symbolic survival rather than operational optimism. Internal garrison surveys conducted by medical staff recorded that over 60% of combat personnel suffered sleep deprivation exceeding 6 consecutive days during peak engagements in mid-March. Civilian adaptation reached its final stage. By 10th of March, fewer than 900 civilians remained alive inside the pocket. These survivors were consolidated into 3 subterranean shelter complexes beneath the former municipal hall, the Eastern School Building, and the River Depot warehouse. Civilian labor was used solely for medical support, corpse removal, and water transport. No remaining non-combat food distribution system functioned after this point. Between 12 and 18 March, the tactical rhythm stabilized into a pattern of daily Soviet artillery harassment, localized infiltration attempts, and German counter-sniping rather than full-scale assault. Casualties dropped in absolute terms, but remained continuous. German losses averaged 8 to 12 per day. Soviet losses averaged 25 to 40 per day across containment forces. The siege had entered a phase where adaptation and controlled endurance replaced the earlier pattern of shock assault and mass counterattack. The operational turning point of the siege of Kholm emerged not inside the pocket itself, but in the broader reconfiguration of German forces on the northwestern front during late March and April 1942. Following the stabilization of the Demyansk sector and the partial restoration of German operational freedom of movement, Army Group North initiated preparations for a limited ground relief operation toward Kolm. Unlike earlier expectations in January and February, this relief effort could now be supported by concentrated artillery, engineering units, and limited armored elements drawn from reorganized rear area reserves. Planning for the relief operation was finalized during the first week of April. The designated striking force consisted primarily of elements from the German 218th Infantry Division and reinforced security formations, with a total strength estimated at approximately 8,000 to 9,500 troops for the initial breakthrough phase. Their operational objective was narrowly defined: open a ground corridor from the west sufficient for regular wheeled supply traffic and medical evacuation, not necessarily to destroy Soviet forces encircling Kholm. Soviet command detected German troop concentrations along the western axis by mid-April through aerial reconnaissance and partisan reporting. In response, additional rifle battalions and anti-tank units were deployed opposite the projected relief corridor. However, The majority of the Soviet formations remained committed to containment positions around the pocket itself, limiting the ability to establish a deep-layered defense outside the siege ring. The German relief offensive commenced at dawn on 23 April 1942. The initial assault was supported by a concentrated artillery preparation involving approximately 140 field guns and heavy mortars. Fire was directed primarily against Soviet trench systems, supply trails, and command points identified during earlier reconnaissance. Under this covering fire, German infantry advanced along two parallel axes, separated by approximately 3.5 kilometers, aiming to converge on the western perimeter of the Kolm pocket. Soviet resistance during the opening 2 days was significant. Rifle units supported by 45 mm and 76 mm anti-tank guns conducted series of delaying actions along forest clearings and frozen marsh approaches. Between 23 and 25 April, Soviet losses in the relief corridor sector are estimated at 900 to 1,200 casualties. German losses for the same period were recorded at approximately 420 killed and wounded. By 28 April, German assault formations had advanced between 18 and 22 kilometers through the Soviet screening zones. The breakthrough remained narrow, averaging only 1.5 to 2 kilometers in width at several points, making it vulnerable to counterattack. Soviet command attempted repeated flanking attacks using ski infantry detachments and artillery strikes on choke points. These actions delayed the advance but failed to sever it. Inside Kholm, the change in situation became evident through increased radio traffic and the audible effect of distant artillery from the west. On 1 May 1942, German airborne supply volume temporarily increased as landing zones outside the forming corridor were secured in stages. Daily deliveries briefly rose to 45-50 tons, still below full requirements but sufficient to prevent complete starvation of the defenders. On 5 May, German forward elements reached positions within 6 kilometers of the western perimeter of Kolm. Soviet command launched a final coordinated attempt to crush the pocket before relief could be completed. 2 rifle regiments supported by direct-fire artillery attacked the weakened southwestern sector of the German defenses. The assault penetrated the outer trench system, but failed to reach the inner fallback line. German defenders reported 76 casualties during this engagement. Soviet losses exceeded 310 men. The decisive contact occurred on 7th of May 1942. At 14:30 hours, German relief units established physical contact with forward defenders from the Kolm garrison near the village of Zhirkovo. The initial supply corridor measured approximately 900 meters in width. Within the first 24 hours, 62 trucks passed into the pocket carrying food, ammunition, and medical equipment. Wounded personnel were evacuated outward for the first time since January. With the opening of the corridor, the siege of Kholm ceased to exist as a sealed encirclement. Although fighting continued along the corridor's edges for several weeks, the operational status of the pocket had fundamentally changed. The Soviet objective of destroying the encircled garrison before relief could be achieved was no longer attainable. The strategic momentum in the Kolm sector shifted away from siege reduction toward containment of the newly established German supply artery. With the ground corridor opened on 7th of May 1942, combat operations around Kolm entered a transitional phase defined by withdrawal, reorganization, and the immediate consequences of 4 months of encirclement. The German command prioritized the evacuation of wounded personnel and the stabilization of supply flow through the newly established corridor, which initially remained under continuous Soviet artillery and small arms fire. During the first week after the link-up, German engineers expanded the corridor from an average width of 900 meters to approximately 1.6 kilometers through the construction of bypass roads, trench clearing operations, and controlled demolitions of Soviet blocking positions. Between 8 and 15th May, a total of 1,420 wounded and severely ill German personnel were evacuated from Kolm by truck convoys. Medical evacuation figures indicate that over 37% of these evacuees suffered from advanced frostbite injuries, starvation-related complications, or untreated infections accumulated during the siege period. At the same time, Inbound supply traffic transported approximately 150 tons of food, ammunition, medical equipment, and winter clothing remnants into the former pocket. For the first time since January, German logistical intake exceeded minimum daily survival requirements. Soviet forces attempted multiple counterattacks against the corridor between 9 and 20 May. These actions involved elements of 3 rifle divisions supported by anti-tank artillery and short-range howitzers. However, the operational focus of the Northwestern Front had begun to shift to other priority sectors, particularly the stabilization effort along the Lovit River and the broader Demyansk zone. Soviet losses during corridor interdiction attempts in this period are estimated at approximately 1,800 to 2,200 casualties. German losses during corridor defense operations totaled approximately 680 killed and wounded. By late May, the German High Command ordered the full evacuation of the Kolm strongpoint. The town had lost its original operational value as a communications junction, and maintaining a forward outpost inside a heavily contested sector was no longer justified. Withdrawal planning was conducted under continuous Soviet observation. Demolition teams destroyed remaining warehouses, command bunkers, and bridge structures to deny immediate reuse by Soviet forces. The staged evacuation began on 30 May 1942. Over a 6-day period, approximately 3,600 remaining German personnel were withdrawn westward through the corridor in convoy formations moving primarily at night. Rearguard elements remained under orders to delay Soviet pursuit and secure demolition points. The final German detachments departed Kolm on 5 June 1942. At 03:20 hours, the last defensive positions inside the former perimeter were vacated. Soviet advance units entered the ruins of Kolm later that morning. Reconnaissance reports documented near-total destruction of central infrastructure. Of the pre-war building stock, an estimated 82% had sustained irreparable structural damage. No functioning industrial facilities remained. Civilian survivors located during the reoccupation numbered fewer than 400 persons. Soviet medical teams recorded widespread malnutrition and advanced disease among the remaining population. Post-withdrawal combat along the former corridor continued sporadically until mid-June, after which German forces completed their repositioning onto a consolidated defensive line approximately 25 kilometers west of Kolm. Soviet units re-established forward supply routes through the ruined town and redirected artillery assets toward neighboring operational sectors. The immediate military outcome of the Kolm operation thus concluded without the destruction of the surrounded German garrison, but also without the restoration of German operational initiative in the broader region. The engagement transitioned from a sealed encirclement into a controlled evacuation under sustained pressure, leaving behind a devastated urban area and heavily depleted formations on both sides. The Siege of Kolm occupies a distinct place within the broader operational history of the Eastern Front in 1942, not because of its scale compared to major battles, but because of the operational and logistical precedents it established. The encirclement lasted from 18th January to 7th May 1942, a total of 110 days. During this period, approximately 5,000 German troops remained surrounded by Soviet forces that at peak strength exceeded 30,000 men. The survival of the garrison through prolonged isolation shaped subsequent German reliance on air-supplied pockets as a temporary operational solution. From a logistical perspective, Kolm represented the first extended German air supply operation conducted under continuous Soviet pressure. Over the course of the siege, the Luftwaffe delivered an estimated 5,200 to 6,000 tons of supplies into the pocket. These deliveries were made primarily using Ju-52 transport aircraft operating from forward airfields under winter conditions. In return, approximately 1,800 to 2,000 wounded were evacuated by air before landing operations became impossible in late February. Aircraft losses during the Kolm airlift amounted to at least 24 Ju-52s destroyed and a larger number damaged beyond immediate repair. These figures later informed German airlift planning at Demyansk and ultimately at Stalingrad, where similar methods were applied on a far larger scale with different outcomes. On the Soviet side, the operation demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of winter encirclement tactics. Soviet forces succeeded in isolating Kolm rapidly, maintaining the encirclement for nearly 4 months and inflicting steady attritional losses. At the same time, the inability to concentrate sufficient heavy artillery and armor in forest and marsh terrain revealed structural weaknesses in Soviet siege reduction capabilities during early 1942. According to post-war Soviet archival summaries, Soviet casualties in the Kholm sector between January and June 1942 exceeded 10,000 killed and wounded. German losses inside the pocket and during the evacuation phase are estimated at approximately 3,500 to 4,000 killed, wounded, and missing combined. The civilian impact of the siege was severe and long-lasting. Pre-war Kolm had a population of approximately 6,000 residents. By June 1942, fewer than 400 civilian survivors remained inside the town. Recorded civilian deaths directly attributable to the siege exceeded 1,000, caused primarily by starvation, cold exposure, untreated illness, and artillery fire. Post-war Soviet reconstruction assessments classified Kolm as more than 80% destroyed. Rehousing and infrastructure restoration continued into the late 1940s, and the town did not recover its pre-war population level for several decades. In military historical evaluation, the siege of Kolm is often examined alongside the Demyansk operation as an early example of the German doctrine of holding isolated strongpoints through air resupply. While tactically successful in the short term, these operations contributed to a broader institutional belief that airlift could compensate for operational encirclement. This assumption, reinforced by survival at Kolm, influenced later strategic decisions in 1942 and 1943 with significantly greater logistical demands and different outcomes. For the Soviet command, Kolm reinforced the importance of coordinated heavy artillery concentration and deep operational reserves for the destruction of encircled enemy forces. Many of the artillery and engineering lessons drawn from the prolonged reduction attempts were applied later in 1943 during encirclement battles, where the Red Army achieved more decisive results. In post-war memory, Kolm remained a secondary battlefield compared to larger operations, yet it became a documented case study in military academies on both sides of the former conflict. German post-war accounts emphasized endurance under isolation, while Soviet studies focused on containment, attrition, and the progressive erosion of enemy combat capability. Modern historiography treats the siege primarily as a logistical and operational episode rather than a decisive tactical battle. The siege did not alter the strategic balance on the Northwestern Front in itself, but it absorbed significant resources, fixed large Soviet formations for months, and demonstrated the structural fragility of prolonged air-supported defense. In this sense, Kolm stands as an early indicator of both the temporary utility and the inherent limits of isolation warfare on the Eastern Front.